this lecture, we're going to move into the end of the 3rd century and into the beginning of the 4th century with an author known as Lactantius. And I'm calling this Lactantius at the turning point of Christian history, because Lactantius is a figure who's around when Constantine rises to power. And he presents a particular version of the story. So we're going to talk about who Lactantius was, what his background and context are, and then what is he trying to do with his work. His work is called On the Deaths of the Persecutors. So what is this work about, and what's he trying to do, and how does this fit in with the time of Constantine? So Lactantius was born probably around the year 260, and he dies around 330. So late 3rd into the early 4th century. Most of our biographical information about him actually comes from Jerome. Jerome has a work called On Illustrious Men, and chapter 80 of On Illustrious Men is about Lactantius, where he gives us some of his biography. In Jerome, he gives us a long list of works that Lactantius wrote. And unfortunately, most of these works are lost to us. So Jerome says he wrote this, and he wrote this, and he wrote this, and he wrote this, and we don't have most of those. So most of his work we don't actually have anymore, unfortunately. But there are some things we know about him. So he is a native of North Africa. He's an African. We don't know if he's from Carthage per se. Some scholars speculate he could be from Numidia, which is the region to the west. So not so much Carthage, which is modern Tunisia, but maybe more Numidia, which is more like modern Algeria. Is that possibly where he's from? In his young life, Lactantius trains to be a scholar. He's trained in classical rhetoric, particularly in Latin. So he's a specialist in Latin rhetoric and Latin literature. And because of this, because of his specialty, he's actually called to Nicomedia by the Emperor Diocletian to teach rhetoric. So yeah, he creates quite a reputation for himself, such that the Emperor Diocletian calls him from Africa to Nicomedia, which is just across the water from where Constantinople will be founded soon afterwards, to teach rhetoric. So Nicomedia in this time is the capital. We talked earlier about Diocletian dividing the empire into 4 parts. Nicomedia is the capital of Diocletian's part of the empire. And he calls Lactantius there. And it's in Nicomedia that it appears Lactantius first meets Constantine. So Constantine was the son of one of the leaders of another part of the empire. He comes to Nicomedia. Lactantius is in Nicomedia. And it seems that Lactantius meets a young Constantine in Nicomedia. They first have a connection there. This is going to become very important later in the life of Lactantius and also in the life of Constantine. It seems that it's maybe in Nicomedia that Lactantius converts to Christianity. He's not a Christian when he comes to Nicomedia, but he converts to Christianity. But then, during the Great Persecution, which we'll be talking about in the next lecture, he's forced to flee. When Diocletian, the one who called him, or who brought him to Nicomedia, when Diocletian begins persecuting Christians, Lactantius is forced to flee. He gives up his profession, and he flees. And he goes to the west. So he goes far to the west, over to Gaul, to what is modern-day France. And it seems that there, in Gaul, or modern-day France, is where he is reunited with Constantine. Once Constantine has gone back to the west and begins building his power base to make a move toward imperial power, toward expanding his own power. So Lactantius is now a Christian living in Gaul. Constantine has some experience, some knowledge of Lactantius, but Constantine at this point is still not, he hasn't had his so-called conversion experience. Christianity at this point is still illegal. Constantine has not risen to power yet, but there's a connection made between Lactantius and Constantine such that Lactantius stays in Constantine's service from this point onward. So as far as we know, for the rest of his days, Lactantius is in the service of Constantine. So he is right there to observe everything that happens in Constantine's career and Constantine's eventual rise to power. So he's an important author because he's so close to these events. Now, as I mentioned earlier, he wrote a lot of things we don't have. But we do have potentially one of his most important works. And it's called On the Deaths of the Persecutors, written sometime between 218 and 221. And there are contextual reasons and content reasons to give us this fairly narrow date. And we talk more about what's in the text. That'll maybe help us understand where this comes from and why the dates are as fairly precise. Actually, I'm just realizing there's an error there. That should say 318 to 321. So my apologies. 318 to 321. Some of you were thinking we suddenly lost 100 years of history. You're right. That should be 318 to 321. So what's happening in this period? Lactantius is in the service of Constantine. Constantine has begun to consolidate his power, but Constantine is not the sole emperor yet. There's still another figure, a guy named Licinius, who's also a co-emperor with Constantine. Now, the truce between Constantine and Licinius is very, very shaky. They don't like each other very much because both of them want the same thing. Both of them ultimately want to be the one true emperor. So Constantine has made his power base in the west, and Licinius has more of a power base in the east. And they have an agreement to leave each other alone, which lasts for a certain period of time. But even while the truce is still there, they're trying to gain the upper hand. In the aftermath of Constantine and Licinius issuing the Edict of Milan, where Christianity becomes legal, suddenly there seem to be Christians everywhere. Christians seem to be coming out of hiding. And Lactantius realizes that this is an opportunity to promote Constantine and to undermine Licinius. So his work on the death of the persecutors is a work of propaganda. We need to be very careful not to read this work and say that it's objective. This is not an objective work of history. This is Licinius writing something where the ultimate goal is to cut down and to criticize and to undermine Licinius, who is the rival of Constantine. So the work is about the persecutors. And the ultimate target of this work is Constantine's rival Licinius. Lactantius wants people to believe that Licinius is a persecutor. This doesn't fit with the other facts that we have, but it's what Lactantius is saying. It's what he's trying to do to strengthen Constantine. So on the death of the persecutors, there are important things that he wants everyone to understand. He wants people to understand that God will bring vengeance and justice against those who harm the faithful. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord, I will repay. Lactantius wants his readers to say, yes, I'm going to show you through history how those who treated Christians poorly always got what's coming to them. God always came back around and punished them. It's called the deaths of the persecutors. All those people who persecuted Christians, this is what happened to them. And in particular, the emperors who had harmed Christians were punished by God. The emperors, the target here is not so much everyday people who persecuted Christians. He's really talking about emperors because his target is Licinius. Licinius is an emperor. So he's talking about emperors who have harmed Christians. And then God punished them. And he lays this out very clearly in the introduction to his work. So in the introductory kind of prologue, if you will, of the work, he says, those who insulted the divinity have been brought low. Those who cast down the holy temple, that is the church, or any who destroyed churches, have fallen with a greater ruin. God delayed punishing them so that, by these examples, he might teach those who come afterward that he alone is God, and that with vengeance he executes judgment on the proud, the impious, and the persecutors. So those who insult God, God gets them back. In fact, look through history. So why didn't God strike an emperor down the first time they did something? Well, because God wanted people to see how bad emperors could get, so that then when God brought his vengeance against them, people could see how great God's vengeance could be. He allowed people to become greater sinners so he could punish them more to show the extent of God's vengeance. So who are some of the stars on the desk of the persecutors? Names that will not surprise you. This is not a complete list, but none of these names will surprise you based on things we talked about and things you may know from other readings. Among those punished by God, Nero. Nero was the first one to persecute the Christians. Did God kill Nero immediately? No. Nero lived for a while, but then his fall was rapid. God really punished Nero. Domitian. Domitian is the emperor who ruled at the end of the 1st century, and the general tradition places the book of Revelation in the time of Domitian at the end of the 1st century. We talked in an earlier lecture about the possibility that at least parts of Revelation could date earlier, could actually date possibly to around the time of Nero. But Domitian at the end of the 1st century is known to have been a persecutor of Christians. We've talked recently in the class about Decius and Valerian, these back-to-back emperors in the 250s, around the time of Cyprian. Both of them persecuted Christians. Both of them were punished by God. Galerius. Galerius was one of the emperors in the time of Diocletian. So when Diocletian is executing the great persecution, Galerius is involved in this. And in many ways, as Lactantius tells the story, Galerius was much more violent, much more bloodthirsty, much more ruthless than Diocletian, or than any other emperor. As Lactantius tells it, even after the persecution had stopped in other places, Galerius continued his persecution. And the last in the line, who has not yet been punished by God, because God is letting him become more and more evil, but will eventually be punished by God, is of course Licinius, Constantine's rival. So what kind of person is Licinius? What kind of emperor is Licinius? He's like Nero. He's like Domitian. He's like Decius. He's like Valerian. He's like Galerius. The worst emperors, Christians, that you can think of, he is another one of these. Now, do the sources bear this out? Other sources do not bear this out. Other sources suggest to us that Licinius was actually fairly favorable toward the Christians. He is the co-author of the edict. The other sources don't tell us that he's out to get Christians. But for the purposes of Lactantius, in the service of Constantine, he wants to make Licinius look bad. And he makes Licinius look very, very bad. So the bad news, Lactantius says, the bad news is Licinius is a terrible emperor. He's a persecutor of Christians like many others. But there's good news. There's good news. The good news is that God has raised up a champion to help the church. God has raised up a champion, a knight in shining armor to help the church and to protect the church and to raise up the church that Licinius wants to tear down. And who is this noble warrior this noble, humble warrior who comes to the service of God only for the good of the church? He is, of course, none other than Constantine, Lactantius' boss, as it turns out. Now, I don't want to be too sarcastic about this, but we need to be very careful when we read things like Lactantius. Lactantius is saying wonderful things about the person who's paying his salary. And there are good reasons to think that he has made some editorial choices in his narrative to highlight things or to de-emphasize other things. In the same introduction that we read earlier, where he talks about striking down these terrible emperors, he says God has raised up princes to reverse the impious and bloody edicts of the tyrants. Tyrants like Nero and Licinius. Well, oh, Lactantius, which great prince has God raised up in your time to protect the people of God? Of course, it's Constantine. And Lactantius doesn't just want us, he said, don't just take my word for it. Don't just take my word that God has raised up Constantine. God proved that he raised up Constantine by sending a sign. God literally sent a sign from heaven to prove that Constantine was his chosen vessel. What was the sign? A symbol in the sky, the Chi Rho, the first two letters of the name of Christ in Greek. Lactantius is the one who tells us a story that before a battle, before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine saw a symbol in the sky, and a voice from heaven said, "In this sign, conquer." And the description that he gives is a little bit ambiguous. So we have two different forms here. It can take other forms. But there's some symbol that Constantine saw, and he put it on the shields of his soldiers, and they went out, and against all odds, Constantine was victorious. Because God was on his side. Because God raised up Constantine to fight the tyrants and to restore the church. Constantine is the chosen symbol, the chosen vessel of God, and here's the proof. God even sent a sign from heaven to prove it. If you don't believe me, believe God. God sent the sign. So if we think about this, Lactantius, this African, we would say an African classics teacher, someone who taught classical languages and classical rhetoric, ends up tied into and involved with imperial politics at the highest level. He writes a very important work of propaganda, political propaganda, on behalf of Constantine against Licinius. So if we think about Africa within the early church and within the late antique world, very early on we looked at a map. It said the Mediterranean Sea means the middle of the land, and Africa is as close to the middle of the land sea as Rome is. And here we see another example of an African really influencing history. We can't say for sure what the overall impact of this work is on the history of Christianity, the history of the Roman Empire, but it certainly had an impact. If you're a Christian residing in the East and you hear this, you think, that Licinius, that's our emperor? You might reasonably say, God, please send Constantine to free us from Licinius. Please give us a noble emperor. And if that's your prayer, eventually that's exactly what happens. Constantine finally defeats Licinius and becomes the sole emperor again. So Lactantius, in many ways, he's like Eusebius. Eusebius is much more famous because more of his works survive. But Eusebius is someone who writes his life of Constantine. He writes other things about the Council of Nicaea to present Constantine in a very certain way, a very positive way. He's one of the important historians of Constantine, only has good things to say. Lactantius in the day was equally important. He was the Western Eusebius in some ways when it came to talking about Constantine. Yes, question?
Yes, but if I'm in the position of Constantine, what I want, if I want to be the emperor, I will not target Christians, the persecuted group. I will target the other Roman officials and the generals and so on.
So the question is, if you're Constantine, why would you target Christians for the propaganda and not other government officials and such? Yeah, by this time, indications from Roman sources and Christian sources are that there were a lot of Christians. And if Constantine, something happens to Constantine. We can debate whether it's a conversion or something. Something happens to him before the Milvian Bridge, since he at least in form begins to give some kind of preference to Christians. So it's an easy audience for Lactantius, because there are lots of Christians in the East. We'll talk about in the next lecture how many Christians there were in Nicomedia. by all accounts, there were a lot of Christians in Nicomedia. This was the capital prior to this. So we may think about government officials, but in some ways, Constantine can deal with government officials by beating Licinius. If he beats Licinius and he takes over, he has a military power, the government will fall into place. What he needs to do is try to win the will of the people. And he clearly understands, and what are his expectations? Does he think that 2/3 of the Eastern Empire is Christians? Probably not. But even if it's a sizable minority, Lactantius can help him get all those Christians on his side. And even if he's not that theologically sophisticated, even if he thinks, I'm kind of going with this God because this God seems maybe to be more powerful than the other gods, he's going to want everyone who follows that God to be on his side. And it's unclear to me that I don't think Constantine has a fully developed theology at this point. He may still be thinking about, this God seems to be more powerful. And Lactantius says, do you want more people who follow that God on your side? I can help you with that. I can see how you might be interested in that and want to pursue that. But clearly it's more than just this that Constantine has to do to consolidate his power. But if he comes to the East to consolidate his power and the Christians in the East think he's dangerous, he'll have a problem. In the same way that Diocletian's had a problem and other emperors have had problems with the Christians. Other questions about Lactantius at this pivot point in history? Yes?
To what extent in this time a text can affect a wide range of people?
Yeah. So to what extent in this time can a text affect a wide range of people? What I'm imagining is happening here is that Lactantius is writing the text. It's being copied, and I imagine it's being sent. Constantinople's not founded yet. It's being sent to Jerusalem. It's being sent to Antioch. It's being sent to Alexandria, at least. Those are the 3 Eastern patriarchs. So I'm imagining at least those 3 cities are targets for this. Because they're also very important political cities, not just for the church. They're very important political cities. I think probably also a copy is being sent to Nicomedia, which is at that time basically functioning as the Eastern capital. So I don't imagine that it's like going viral on the internet, that everyone's hearing about this. Because it's not practical. You couldn't make enough copies of this fast enough to get the word out there fast enough. But you can make 4 copies. Let's say, what I think is the minimum. I think there are more. I think there's probably one going to Ephesus. I think there's probably one going to Corinth. But let's just say the minimum. Nicomedia, Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria. You can get those 4 cities and those 4 churches to think that your emperor is going to be their savior. That's very powerful because those churches all have the spheres of influence around them. And so if you can convince the bishop of Alexandria that Constantine is the one we want, immediately he can begin to spread that, to preach that, and to get that word out all across his area. But not as quickly as we could do it today. So I'm imagining a more targeted audience, but really important and significant audiences.
Is on deaths of the persecutors a document that is read out in public?
Is on the deaths of the persecutors a document read out in public?
In churches?
In churches and such. I can imagine that it could be. Maybe not liturgically, but I can see it being distributed in that way. If you read it, it's a very entertaining document. I mean, it is. It's kind of like an action movie in a bad way. Right? It's bad action, but it's like an action movie. It's not a boring. You don't get a lot of long discussions of theology. It's very action-packed, and it fits like a lot of contemporary action movies. There's a lot of blood in it. And so it's not hard it kindles people's imagination. It keeps your interest. So I can see it being read out potentially. Probably not in a liturgical setting, but in other settings possibly. Yeah.
But it was a strange idea that Williams got. This was strange, especially the first church writers. This is only the first document that I read it about the vengeance of God.
Oh, so is this the first document particularly about the vengeance of God against against emperors who had harmed Christians?
When I read it, it was a new idea.
Yeah, so it's certainly I would have to look and see if it's the first time we see this idea of God's vengeance against emperors. But I would say that after this, even the work that I do on the martyrdom accounts of Peter and Paul, in the later period, by the 5th and 6th century, a standard feature of all the text is the horrible death that Nero died because he killed Peter and Paul. So this idea of emperors, past emperors being punished because of what they did to Christians, if Lactantius, does he create it or not, I don't know, but it was very popular. It seemed people really liked that idea. Because, let's be honest, it appeals to people, right? It's one thing to say, in the final judgment, these people who killed your parents, in the final judgment, they'll be judged. Okay. But they're going to be judged now. On a human side, that just appeals to us in a much more interesting way. So, yeah.
Is there any other source for the story of the symbol?
Is there any other source for the story of the symbol? Lactantius is the one who tells it. It gets picked up later. Other people continue the story. But he's the one who tells us this. And the idea is that Lactantius this is a period of time when this happens, Eusebius is not with Constantine. Lactantius is with Constantine. And I've seen in movies, I've seen this idea of reflected where on the night before the battle, or leading up to the battle, you have this older man, Lactantius, saying to Constantine, you need to accept the one true God. And Constantine's like, oh, no. And then Constantine has this vision. And so, which picks up on the idea, that, which I think is right, Lactantius is very close to Constantine. And so on the one hand, if this happened, he would be the one to know about it, right? So am I saying that I doubt Constantine had a vision? I'm not saying that I doubt he had a vision, but Lactantius certainly took that story and spun it in a very particular way. That's not, it's one thing to say Constantine had a vision and God convinced this pagan emperor of the one true God. Is that possible? I think it's entirely possible. But what Lactantius does is he also spins it backwards and against Licinius. And that's where I think he may lead us astray in terms of the history.
Another one. How did the view of the church changed from honoring martyrdom to honoring the emperor and the peace of the empire?
Yeah, so how does the mentality change from honoring the martyrs to honoring the peace of the empire? I think this is one of the very difficult things for Christians in the 4th century. And I've written a bit on this, that let's imagine you're going to Rome and you're on the Ostian Road, and in the year 300, or let's say 305, in the middle of the persecution of Diocletian, there's a shrine on the Ostian Road in honor of Paul. And there's a shrine on the Appian Road in honor of Peter and Paul together. What do these things symbolize? This symbolizes the apostle standing up against the Roman emperor, Nero, and being killed by a Roman emperor. It's a symbol of the power of faith and the evil intentions and evil actions of the Roman Empire. Right. Then, things change suddenly. And so Constantine builds a bigger church on the same spot. And so now you come back to the same spot. And when you were a kid, you went to the shrine of Peter and Paul, or the shrine of Paul, to remember how bad the emperors were. And now you're going, and now they're built by the emperors. They have the emperor's name on the front of them. It must have been very strange. So you can almost hear a little kid grabbing his mom on the shirt. So mommy, are we supposed to like the emperors or not like the emperors? Because now I'm confused. And the way that Constantine acted, and we'll see some of this in the Donatist controversy, I think there's 10 or 15 years there where Christians still are really not sure what to make of all this. And I think Lactantius is trying to tell them this is going to be a good thing. But for the Africans, the arrival of Constantine is not necessarily a good thing. And I imagine there's great turmoil there. On a smaller scale, when Saul is going to Damascus and he has his experience, and then he goes away, and he comes back and he says, now I'm here to preach the gospel. Understandably, the other Christian leaders were like, what? It's clear from the text, it takes them some time to trust him. Well, imagine the much larger scale. How long does it take the word to ripple through the empire that now the emperors are on our side? Can we really believe this is true? I think there's a real messy part there in the history of Christianity. It's hard for us to put ourselves in that context. I think for a while Christians are really wrestling with this. And but they're not going to kill us anymore? What do we do now? Right? What do we do now? How do we prove that we are the elite class of Christians? What do we do? Yeah, this reversal is dramatic, and perhaps for some Christians traumatic.